Well, welcome back. Hope you're enjoying a snack. I am enjoying these old windmill cookies that I haven't had in so long. Now we'll find out what was happening with Aravis while Shasta had been with the the Narnians. Chapter 7. Aravis in Tashbaan. What had really happened was this. When Aravis saw Shasta hurried away by the Narnians and found herself alone with 2 horses, who, very wisely, wouldn't say a word, she never lost her head, even for a moment. She grabbed Bree's halter and stood still, holding both the horses, and though her heart was beating as hard as a hammer, she did not show it. As soon as the Narnian lords had passed, she tried to move on again, but before she could take another step, another crier, "Bother all these people," thought Aravis, was heard shouting, "Way, way, way, way for the Tarkina," and this is the name I need to learn to pronounce better, Lasaraleen, there we go, Lasaraleen, not a name I'm familiar with. And immediately following the crier came 4 armed slaves, and then 4 bearers carrying a litter, which was all aflutter with silken curtains, and all a jingle with silver bells, and was scented the whole street with perfumes and flowers. After the litter, female slaves in beautiful clothes, and then a few grooms, runners, pages, and the like. And now Aravis made her first mistake. She knew Lasaraleen quite well, almost as if they had been in school together, because they had often stayed at the same houses and been to the same parties. And Aravis couldn't help looking up to see what Lasaraleen looked like now that she was married and a very great person indeed. It was fatal. The eyes of the 2 girls met, and immediately Lasaraleen sat up in the litter and burst out at the top of her voice, "Aravis, what on earth are you doing here? Your father—" There was not a moment to lose. Without a second's delay, Aravis let go of the horses, caught the edge of the litter, swung herself up beside Lasaraleen, and whispered furiously in her ear, "Shut up! Do you hear? Shut up! You must hide me. Tell your people—" "But, darling," began Lasaraleen in the same loud voice. She didn't in the least mind making people stare at her. In fact, she rather liked it. "Do what I tell you, or I'll never speak to you again," hissed Aravis. "Please, quick. Please, lass. It's frightfully important. Tell your people to bring those 2 horses along. Pull all the curtains of the litter and get away somewhere where I can't be found. And do hurry." "All right, darling," said Lasaraleen in her lazy voice. "Here, 2 of you, take the Tarkina's horses." This was to the slaves. "And now home. I say, darling, do you think we really want the curtains drawn on a day like this? I mean to say—" But Aravis had already drawn the curtains, enclosing Lasaraleen and herself in a rich and scented, but rather stuffy kind of tent. "I mustn't be seen," she said. "My father doesn't know I'm here. I'm running away." "My dear, how perfectly thrilling," said Lasaraleen. "I'm dying to hear all about it. Darling, you're sitting on my dress. Do you mind? That's better. It's a new one. Do you like it? I got it at—" "Oh, lass, do be serious," said Aravis. "Where's my father?" "Didn't you know?" said Lasaraleen. "He's here, of course. He came to town yesterday and is asking about you everywhere. And to think of you and me being here together and his not knowing anything about it. It's the funniest thing I've ever heard." And she went off into giggles. She always had been a terrible giggler, as Aravis now remembered. "It isn't funny at all," she said. "It's dreadfully serious. Where can you hide me?" "No difficulty at all, my dear girl," said Lasaraleen. "I'll take you home. My husband's away and no one will see you." "Phew! It's not much fun with the curtains drawn. I want to see people. There's no point in having a new dress on if no one's to go about shut up if there's no point in having a new dress on if one's to go about shut up like this." "I hope no one heard you when you shouted out to me like that," said Aravis. No, of course, darling," said Lasaraleen absent-mindedly. "But you haven't even told me yet what you think of the dress." Another thing, said Aravis, you must tell your people to treat those 2 horses very respectfully. That's part of the secret. They're really talking horses from Narnia. Fancy, said Lasaralina. How exciting. And, oh, darling, have you seen the barbarian queen from Narnia? She's staying in Tashbaan at present. They say Prince Rabadash is madly in love with her. There have been the most wonderful parties and hunts and things all this last fortnight. I can't say she's so very pretty myself, but some of the Narnian men are lovely. I was taken on a river party the day before yesterday, and I was wearing my... Oh, how shall we prevent your people telling everyone that you've got a visitor dressed like a beggar's brat in your house? It might so easily get round to my father. Now, don't keep on fussing, there's a dear, said Lasaraline. We'll get you in some proper clothes in a moment. And here we are. The bearers had stopped, and the litter was being lowered. When the curtains had been drawn, Aravis found that she was in a courtyard garden, very much like the one Shasta had been taken to a few minutes earlier in another part of the city. Lasaraline would have gone indoors at once, but Aravis reminded her in a frantic whisper to say something to the slaves about not telling anyone of their mistress's strange visitor. Sorry, darling, it had gone right out of my head, said Lasaraline. Here, all of you. And you, doorkeeper, no one is to be let out of this house today. And anyone I catch talking about this young lady will be first beaten to death and then burned alive, and after that be kept on bread and water for 6 weeks. There. Although Lasaraline said she was dying to hear Aravis' story, she showed no sign of really wanting to hear it at all. She was, in fact, much better at talking than at listening. She insisted on Aravis having a long and luxurious bath. Callan baths are famous. And then dressing her up in the finest clothes before she would let her explain anything. The fuss she made about choosing the dresses nearly drove Aravis mad. She remembered now that Lasaraline had always been like that, interested in clothes and parties and gossip. Aravis had always been more interested in bows and arrows and horses and dogs and swimming. You will guess that each one thought the other silly. But when at last they had both seated after a meal, was chiefly of whipped cream and jelly and fruit and ice sort, in a beautiful pillared room, which Aravis would have liked better if Lasaraline's spoiled pet monkey hadn't been climbing about all the time. Lasaraline at last asked her why she was running away from home. When Aravis had finished telling her the story, Lasaraline said, But darling, why don't you marry Ahashta Tarkan? Everyone's crazy about him. My husband said he's beginning to be one of the greatest men in Calormen. He has been made Grand Vizier now. He has been made Grand Vizier now. Old Axtra has died. Didn't you know? I don't care. I can't stand the sight of him, said Aravis. But, darling, only think. 3 palaces, and one of them, that beautiful one down on the lake at Ilkeen. Positively ropes of pearls, I'm told, baths of asses' milk, and you'll see a lot of me. He can keep his pearls and palaces as far as I'm concerned, said Aravis. You always were a queer girl, Aravis, said Lasaraline. What more do you want? In the end, however, Aravis managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest, and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about getting the 2 horses out of the north gate and then on to the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddle horse down to the river. And Lasaraline had plenty of grooms to send. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Aravis herself. She suggested that she could be carried out in the litter with the curtains drawn. But Lasaraline told her that litters were only used in the city, and the sight of one going out through the gate would certainly lead to questions. When they had talked for a long time, and it was all the longer because Aravis found it hard to keep her friend to the point, at last Lasaraline clapped her hands and said, Oh, I have an idea. There's one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisrock's garden, may he live forever, runs right down to the water, and there's a little water door. Only for the palace people, of course. But then, you know, dear, here she tittered a little, we almost are palace people. I say, it's lucky for you that you came to me. The dear Tisrock, may he live forever, is so kind. We're asked to the palace almost every day, and it's like a second home. I love all the dear princes and princesses, and I positively adore Prince Rapidash. I might run in and see if any of the palace ladies at any hour of the day or night. Why shouldn't I slip in with you after dark and let you out by the water door? There are always a few punts and things tied up outside it, and even if we're caught, all would be lost, said Aravis. Oh, darling, don't get so excited, said Lasaraline. I was going to say, even if we were caught, everyone would only say it was one of my mad jokes. I'm getting quite well known for them. Only the other day, do listen, dear, this is frightfully funny. I meant all would be lost for me, said Aravis a little sharply. Oh, yes, I do see what you mean, darling. Well, can you think of a better plan? Aravis couldn't, and answered, No, we'll have to risk it. When can we start? Oh, not tonight, said Lasaraline. Of course not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes, and the whole palace will be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd, too. It would have been tomorrow night. This was bad news for Aravis, but she had to make the best of it. The afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Lasaraline went to the banquet, for Aravis was very tired of her giggling and her talk about dresses and parties, weddings and engagements and scandals. She went to bed early, and that part she did enjoy. It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. Lasaraline wanted to go back on the whole arrangement and kept on telling Aravis that Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice, inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was mad to think of going there. And with the peasant boy, too, said Lasaraline. Darling, think of it. It's not nice. Aravis had thought of it a good deal, but she was so tired of Lasaraline's silliness by now, and for the first time, she began to think that traveling with Shasta was rather more fun than fashionable life in Tashbaan. So she only replied, You forget that I'll be a nobody, just like him, when we get to Narnia. And anyway, I promised. And to think, said Lasaraline, almost crying, that if only you had sense you could be the wife of a Grand Vizier. Aravis went away to have a few private words with the horses. You must go with the groom a little before sunset down to the tombs, she said. No more of those packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again. But there'll be food in Wynn's saddlebag and a full water skin behind yours, Bree. The man has orders to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge. And then Narnia and the north, whispered Bree. But what if Shasta's not at the tombs? Wait for him, of course, said Aravis. I hope I've been quite comfortable. Never better stabled in my life, said Bree. But if the husband of that Tirring Tarkina friend of yours is paying his head groom to get the best oats, then I think the head groom is cheating him. Aravis and Lasaraline had supper in the pillared room. About 2 hours later, they were ready to start. Aravis was dressed to look like a superior slave girl in a great house and wore a veil over her face. They had all agreed that if any questions were asked, Lasaraline would pretend that Aravis was a slave she was taking as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went out on foot. A very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Here there were, of course, soldiers on guard, but the officer knew Lasaraline quite well and called his men to attention and saluted. They passed at once into the hall of black marble. A fair number of courtiers, slaves, and others were still moving about here, but this only made the girls less conspicuous. They passed on into the Hall of Pillars and then on to the Hall of Statues and down the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description, what they could see of it in the dim light of the lamps. Presently they came out into the garden court, which sloped downhill in a number of terraces. On the far side of that they came to the old palace. It had already grown almost dark, and they now found themselves in a maze of corridors lit only by occasional torches fixed in brackets to the walls. Lasaraline halted at a place where you had to go either left or right. Go on, do go on, whispered Aravis, whose heart was beating terribly, and who still felt that her father might run into them at any corner. I was just wondering, said Lasaraline. I'm not absolutely sure which way we go from here. I think it's the left. Yes, I'm almost sure it's the left. What fun this is. They took the left way and found themselves in a passage that was hardly lit at all, and which soon began going down steps. "It's all right," said Lasaraline. "I'm sure we're right now. I remember these steps." But at that moment a moving light appeared ahead. A second later there appeared from round a distant corner the dark shape of two men walking backwards and carrying tall candles. And of course it was only before royalties that people walk backwards. Aravis felt Lasaraline grip her arm, then a sort of a sudden grip with almost a pinch, which meant that the person who was gripping you was very frightened indeed. Aravis thought it odd that Lasaraline should be afraid of the Tisroc if he were really such a friend of hers, but there was no time to go on thinking. Lasaraline was hurrying her back to the top of the steps on tiptoe and groping wildly along the wall. "Here's a door," she whispered. "Quick!" They went in, drew the door very softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Aravis could hear by Lasaraline's breathing that she was terrified. "Tash, preserve us," whispered Lasaraline. "What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide?" There was a soft carpet under their feet. They groped forward into the room and blundered onto a sofa. "Let's lie down behind it," whispered Lasaraline. "Oh, I do wish we hadn't come." There was just room between the sofa and the curtained wall, and the two girls got down. Lasaraline managed to get the better position and was completely covered. The upper part of Aravis's face stuck out beyond the sofa, so that if anyone came into the room with a light and happened to look in exactly the right place, they would see her. But of course, she was wearing a veil. What they would not at all... But of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they saw would not at once look like a forehead and a pair of eyes. Aravis shoved desperately to try and make Lasaraline give her a little more room, but Lasaraline, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave it up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, but there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" said Aravis at last in the tiniest possible whisper. I think so," began Lasaraline. "But my poor nerves." And then came the most terrible noise they could have heard at that moment, the noise of the door opening. And then came light, and because Aravis couldn't get her head any further down behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came the two slaves, deaf and dumb, as Aravis rightly guessed, and therefore used at the most secret councils, walking backwards and carrying candles. They took up their stand, one at each end of the sofa. This was a good thing, for of course it was now harder for anyone to see Aravis once a slave was in front of her, and she was looking between his heels. Then came an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap, by which she immediately knew he was the Tisroc. The least of the jewels with which he was covered was worth more than all the clothes and weapons of the Narnian lords put together. But he was so fat, and such a mass of frills and pleats and baubles and buttons and tassels and talismans, that Aravis couldn't help thinking that the Narnian fashions, at any rate for men, looked nicer. After him came a tall young man with a feathered and jeweled turban on his head and an ivory-sheathed scimitar at his side. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came a little hump-backed, wizened old man in whom she recognized, with a shudder, the new Grand Vizier and her own betrothed husband, Ahashta Tarkin himself. As soon as all three had entered the room and the door was shut, the Tisroc seated himself on the divan with a sigh of contentment. The young man took his place standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows and laid his face on the carpet. And what do you think the secret council is going to be all about? We'll find out tomorrow night.